All right, listener, get ready because today we're going deep into a true crime mystery that's as chilling as it is unresolved. The bag murders that terrorized New York City back in the mid-70s between 1975 and 1977.
Wow, yeah, talk about a case that sends shivers down your spine.
It's a story that's stuck with me for a long time, and I know you've done a lot of research on this one.
Oh, yeah, imagine, just picture the headlines. 6 men found dismembered, their remains stuffed into garbage bags and dumped right into the Hudson River.
It's the kind of case that just gets under your skin, you
Yeah.
know? And what makes it even more haunting is that all these years later, those victims, they still haven't been identified,
And the killer was never caught.
like a ghost story in real life.
It really is. And to fully grasp the implications of this case, we have to rewind a bit, go back to the historical context.
Yeah, take us back to that time.
We're talking about the mid-1970s, a time when discrimination against the LGBTQ community was just rampant.
It was a very different time.
Absolutely. And sadly, acts of violence against this community, well, they often went unnoticed or unreported, even unpunished.
So let's unpack the facts in this case. What do we actually know about how these grim discoveries were made?
All right, well, picture this. Multiple garbage bags, each one containing human remains found floating in the Hudson River.
Oh, God.
It was a gruesome discovery, and it immediately sent shockwaves through the city. It was through painstaking investigation that the police were able to determine that these remains, they belonged to 6 different men, all of them dismembered.
It's a truly horrific image. Were investigators able to determine anything about the victims' identities?
That's where the mystery really deepens. The victims remain unidentified even to this day. But there were some clues. Based on the clothing that was found with the remains, investigators believe that the victims, they likely frequented Greenwich Village, which at the time was known for its thriving gay nightlife and leather shops.
So were investigators assuming that these men were part of the LGBTQ community based on that connection to Greenwich Village?
It was the working theory given the evidence they had at the time. And this is where the investigation takes a turn towards a specific individual.
Right.
Enter Paul Bateson, a resident of Greenwich Village who was arrested in '77 for a completely different murder, the killing of film reporter Addison Verrill.
Okay, so we have a potential suspect, but for a different crime. How does Bateson connect to the bag murders?
During Bateson's trial for the murder of Addison Verrill, a witness came forward claiming that Bateson had confessed to them, admitting not only to Verrill's murder, but to also killing 3 other men back in 1973.
Wow.
But here's where the story intersects with the bag murders. This witness claimed that Bateson also admitted to dismembering 6 gay men and then dumping their remains in the Hudson River.
That's a chilling detail, especially since it aligns with the modus operandi or MO of the bag murders. But given this testimony, why wasn't Bateson ever charged in connection with the bag murders?
Yeah. That's a great question, and it gets to the heart of the complexities of this case. Unfortunately, the witness testimony wasn't strong enough to build a solid legal case against Bateson for the bag murders. There simply wasn't enough physical evidence to connect him directly to those crimes. So, while he was convicted of Verrill's murder and received a 20 years to life sentence, the bag murders remained officially unsolved.
So even with this confession on record, the case remained open. It's almost like these victims were invisible in the eyes of the law.
That sense of invisibility is something that deeply affected the LGBTQ community at the time. Remember, societal prejudices, they often led to a lack of urgency or attention when crimes were committed against marginalized groups. And Bateson, for his part, he maintained his innocence in the bag murders right up until his death, leaving behind a tangled web of unanswered questions.
It's a truly unsettling turn of events. But then there's this unexpected twist of William Friedkin, the director of The Exorcist, entering the picture. Yeah. What was his connection to this case?
This is where things get particularly strange. It turns out that Paul Bateson, the man at the center of this mystery, actually had a small role as an X-ray technician in the film The Exorcist. So that's how he and Friedkin knew each other.
Okay, so the possible suspect in these gruesome killings had a part in one of the most iconic horror films of all time. It's hard to imagine a more bizarre connection.
It is a strange juxtaposition. And Friedkin, captivated by the case, he actually visited Bateson in prison.
Oh.
The director was working on adapting a novel called Cruising into a film, and during his conversations with Bateson, he began incorporating elements inspired by the bag murders into his screenplay.
Wait, a movie was made about these murders.
Oh.
I can only imagine the kind of controversy that generated.
You're right to anticipate that when Cruising, starring Al Pacino, was released in 1980, it ignited a firestorm of criticism and protests from the LGBTQ community.
Oh, I bet.
Many saw the film as homophobic and exploitative, deeply concerned that it would reinforce negative stereotypes and potentially incite violence against gay men.
So the film, Instead of shedding light on the violence that this community was already facing, ended up further marginalizing them. What aspects of the film caused such a strong reaction?
Cruising was set in the underground S&M leather scene of New York City. Critics argued that this setting, combined with the film's depiction of a serial killer targeting gay men, created this dangerous and inaccurate portrayal of gay life.
Oh, wow.
There were fears that the film was blurring the lines between homosexuality and violence, playing into existing prejudices.
It seems like a classic case of a film trying to capitalize on a real-life tragedy without fully understanding or respecting the community it was portraying.
The LGBTQ community felt deeply misrepresented and feared the potential real-world consequences of such a distorted portrayal. The protests during filming, the attempts to halt production, the widespread boycotts upon the film's release all spoke to the depth of their anger and concern.
It's a tragic irony, isn't it? A film intended to explore a dark crime ended up perpetuating the very darkness it was trying to expose. But amidst this controversy, there was one journalist who was trying to tell a different story, a more truthful story, about the violence that the gay community in Greenwich Village was facing.
You're talking about Arthur Bell, a journalist for The Village Voice, who was doing some truly groundbreaking work at the time. He was one of the few journalists who seemed to genuinely care about reporting on the violence against gay men, and he did so with courage and integrity.
So while the mainstream media was largely ignoring or sensationalizing these crimes, Arthur Bell was giving a voice to the voiceless.
That's a great way to put it. Bell wasn't afraid to tackle difficult topics. He wrote extensively and fearlessly about the murders of gay men in Greenwich Village. His articles often highlighted the lack of police attention and the dismissive attitude often encountered by victims within their own community.
Bell's work must have been pretty controversial given the social climate at the time.
It absolutely was. Remember, this was the late 1970s, and homophobia was deeply ingrained in society. Bell's articles often faced backlash, but he never wavered in his commitment to reporting on these issues, even when doing so put his own safety and reputation at risk. He understood the power of journalism to expose injustice and challenge prevailing narratives.
Bell's courage and his dedication to speaking truth to power is inspiring, particularly given the lack of support he likely received. His work seems even more crucial when you consider that he was reporting on these murders during the same time that Cruising was being filmed and released.
You've hit on a crucial point. Bell's work served as a stark counterpoint to the sensationalized and exploitative portrayal of the LGBTQ community presented in Cruising. He was providing a more authentic and nuanced perspective, one that was rooted in the lived experiences of the community he was writing about.
So while Friedkin was using the Bag murders as inspiration for a fictionalized and arguably harmful film, Bell's trying to capture the real human cost of these crimes and the systemic issues that allowed them to happen.
That's a powerful way to frame the contrast between their approaches. And it speaks to the importance of responsible storytelling, particularly when it comes to representing marginalized communities.
This deep dive has already taken us down some dark and unexpected paths. We've explored a string of brutal, unsolved murders, a possible suspect with a chilling connection to Hollywood, and a controversial film that, despite its intentions, ended up causing more harm than good.
And we've only just begun to scratch the surface of this complex and multi-layered case. What we've uncovered so far reveals a dark undercurrent of prejudice and violence that was directed at the LGBTQ community during this era.
It's heartbreaking to think that these victims were marginalized in life and then seemingly forgotten in death. Their stories, however, deserve to be heard and understood, but there's more to uncover, isn't there?
There is, and it involves taking a closer look at how the Bag murders, despite the lack of closure in the investigation, became a catalyst for a broader conversation about social justice and the fight for LGBTQ rights.
This is already such a heavy story, but I'm ready to keep exploring. Don't go anywhere, listener. We'll be right back with more on this deep dive into the Bag murders.
You know, it's fascinating how a TV show decades later could reignite public interest in a cold case like this. I'm talking, of course, about the Netflix series Mindhunter, which devoted an entire episode to exploring the Bag murders and the possible involvement of Paul Bateson.
Yeah, it's crazy how a show like Mindhunter, known for its chilling interviews with real-life serial killers, could bring this decades-old case back into the spotlight. What do you think it was about the show's portrayal that captivated viewers?
Well, Mindhunter is a masterclass in exploring not just the psychology of criminals, but also the cultural and social context in which their crimes take place. In the case of the Bag murders, the show went beyond simply rehashing the facts. They delved into the pervasive homophobia of the time, showing how those attitudes shaped the investigation and in many ways allowed these crimes to happen.
It's almost like the show was holding up a mirror to society, forcing viewers to confront the uncomfortable truth about how prejudice and indifference can create an environment where such tragedies can occur.
Exactly. Mindhunter didn't shy away from portraying the harsh realities faced by the LGBTQ community in the 1970s. They highlighted how their lives were often devalued, their stories silenced, and their deaths met with apathy. The episode on the bag murders served as a powerful reminder of the systemic biases that allowed these crimes to happen and hindered efforts to bring the perpetrator to justice.
And I think the show's reputation for meticulous research and gripping storytelling also played a role in its impact. Viewers trust Mindhunter to present a nuanced and informed perspective, even when dealing with difficult and sensitive subject matter.
You're absolutely right. The show's creators went to great lengths to ensure accuracy and authenticity in their portrayal of the bag murders. But let's shift our focus back to Arthur Bell for a moment. His work as a journalist during this period was nothing short of groundbreaking. Remember, he was writing for The Village Voice, a publication known for its progressive stance and willingness to tackle controversial issues.
Yeah, Bell was truly a pioneer in covering the violence and discrimination that plagued the gay community at a time when few others dared to do so. His reporting provided a much-needed platform for those stories to be heard.
His work was absolutely crucial in bringing these issues to light. He understood that silence and fear were the enemies of justice, and that shining a light on these crimes was the first step toward ending them. He wrote extensively about the specific challenges faced by the LGBTQ community in getting their stories heard, how the fear of being outed often prevented victims from reporting crimes, and how a lack of trust in law enforcement made many reluctant to seek help. He gave a voice to those who had been silenced for far too long.
It's incredible to think about the impact he had, especially considering the risks he took by writing about such sensitive topics during such a hostile time. He was shining a light on a very dark corner of society.
Bell was unflinching in his pursuit of the truth. His writing challenged the prevailing narrative and forced people to confront the reality of anti-gay violence. He was a tireless advocate for the LGBTQ community, using his platform to amplify their voices and demand justice.
Bell's commitment to reporting on these issues is a testament to his courage and his understanding of the power of journalism to effect change. But we can't talk about the cultural impact of the bag murders without addressing the controversy surrounding the film Cruising.
Cruising is a complicated piece of this story. It attempted to explore the same dark world that Arthur Bell was reporting on, but it did so in a way that many found deeply problematic.
Right. Can you remind our listener why the LGBTQ community reacted so strongly against Cruising?
Well, the film, which starred Al Pacino as an undercover cop infiltrating the underground S&M leather scene to catch a serial killer targeting gay men, relied heavily on stereotypes and tropes that the community found deeply offensive and harmful.
So instead of presenting a nuanced and sensitive portrayal of the LGBTQ community, the film resorted to sensationalism and exploitation, further fueling the prejudices that were already contributing to the violence they were facing.
Exactly. Critics argued that Cruising conflated homosexuality with violence and deviance, perpetuating the dangerous idea that gay men were somehow inherently dangerous or predatory.
It seems like the film was more interested in shocking audiences than in providing an accurate and empathetic portrayal of the community it was depicting.
The LGBTQ community saw Cruising as a dangerous misrepresentation of their lives, fearing that it would reinforce negative stereotypes and incite further violence against them.
Their concerns were clearly justified. The film sparked a huge backlash, didn't it?
It absolutely did. The LGBTQ community and their allies organized protests during filming, attempted to shut down production, and launched widespread boycotts when the film was released.
It's a shame that a film that claimed to be exploring a dark chapter in history ended up adding to the darkness.
It is a tragic irony. The very community that the film was supposedly shedding light on felt betrayed and exploited by its portrayal. This controversy sparked a long overdue conversation about the responsibility of filmmakers when depicting marginalized communities and the importance of authentic representation.
This deep dive has exposed some truly disturbing aspects of our recent past. A series of brutal, unsolved murders, a possible suspect with a Hollywood connection, a controversial film that seemed to do more harm than good, and a society grappling with its own prejudices.
It's a multifaceted story, and it reveals a lot about the challenges faced by the LGBTQ community during this era. Despite the lack of a definitive answer in the bag murders investigation, Arthur Bell's courageous reporting and the controversy surrounding Cruising served as catalysts for a larger cultural shift, bringing the issue of anti-gay violence into the public consciousness.
It seems like the bag murders, despite their horrific nature, became a touchstone for broader conversations about social justice and the fight for equality.
That's a powerful insight. It's important to remember that these crimes were happening alongside the burgeoning gay rights movement. The Stonewall riots had occurred just a few years earlier in 1969, sparking a wave of activism and demands for equality. The Bag murders added another layer of urgency to this movement.
So while the killer or killers may never be brought to justice, the case itself had a profound impact on the fight for LGBTQ rights.
Absolutely. It exposed the vulnerability of the LGBTQ community and highlighted the urgent need for greater awareness, understanding, and protection.
It's a stark reminder that progress is often born out of tragedy,
Right.
and that the fight for justice is an ongoing process.
And that fight requires vigilance, empathy, and a willingness to challenge injustice wherever we see it. But there's one more aspect of the Bag murders' cultural impact that we need to explore.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Let's continue our deep dive and see where this leads. Stay with us, listener. We'll be back in a moment. Okay, so we're back, listener, and ready to kind of wrap things up on this deep dive into the Bag murders. It's been quite a journey unearthing this dark chapter in New York City's history and confronting all those societal prejudices that really allowed these crimes to happen and then just go unsolved for so long. You mentioned that there's another layer to this story, something about the case becoming a catalyst for change.
Yeah, what's really remarkable is how the Bag murders, despite their horrific nature and the lack of closure in the investigation, actually became a touchstone for those broader conversations about social justice, especially within the LGBTQ community.
So these crimes, as tragic as they were, actually helped to maybe galvanize the fight for LGBTQ rights.
You got to think about it. The victims were marginalized because of their sexual orientation. Their deaths were largely ignored by the mainstream media, and the police investigation, well, it seemed to lack that real sense of urgency. The case just exposed the vulnerability of the LGBTQ community and highlighted all those systemic biases they had to face.
It's almost as if these crimes forced society to acknowledge the reality of anti-gay violence, something that had been largely swept under the rug.
Exactly. The Bag murders became a rallying cry for greater awareness, understanding, and ultimately for change. It wasn't just about the violence itself, but about the systemic biases that allowed it to happen and really to persist.
Yeah, it seems like these crimes, as horrifying as they were, served as a wake-up call for society.
It's a really powerful way to put it. And it's important to remember that this was happening alongside the burgeoning gay rights movement. The Stonewall riots had occurred just a few years earlier in 1969, sparking a wave of activism and demands for equality. And the Bag murders kind of added another layer of urgency to this movement.
It's hard to believe that something so dark could ultimately lead to such positive change.
It speaks to the resilience of the LGBTQ community and their allies who just refuse to let these crimes be forgotten or to allow the victims to be defined just by their tragic deaths. They demanded justice not just for the victims, but for their entire community.
So while the perpetrator of these crimes may have evaded to capture the hero, the impact of the Bag murders continues to resonate today.
Absolutely. The case serves as a potent reminder of all the progress that has been made in the fight for LGBTQ rights since the 70s, but it also underscores the fact that the fight for equality and justice, it's an ongoing process.
Yeah, it's a reminder that we can never become complacent. We have to always be vigilant in challenging prejudice and discrimination whenever we encounter it.
You hit the nail on the head. The Bag murders, while a really dark chapter in our history, they also represent a turning point. They forced society to confront its own biases and ignited a movement that continues to push for a more just and equitable world for everyone.
Listener, we've taken you on a deep dive into a truly chilling and complex case. The Bag murders of 1970s New York City. We've explored those gruesome discoveries, the prime suspect who was never officially charged, the controversial film that sparked so much outrage, and that courageous journalist who gave a voice to a marginalized community.
Yeah, and we've examined how this case, despite its unresolved ending, sparked a movement for change and became a symbol of the fight for LGBTQ rights.
It's a story that reminds us that even in the darkest of times, hope can emerge and progress, though often slow and painful as possible.
As we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with something to think about. What lessons can we learn from the Bag murders to ensure that all members of our community, regardless of their sexual orientation or any other aspect of their identity, feel safe, seen, and protected?
It's a question worth asking ourselves, not just today, but every single day.